The clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of classical music did little to soothe Julian Vance. Standing on the balcony of his penthouse, he looked over the city that his family had built, his jaw tight. The letter from his grandfather's estate lawyer burned a hole in his pocket. He had exactly 48 hours to marry, or his controlling shares in Vance Global would be liquidated and donated to a shell charity. It was a final mocking test from a man who had always controlled him from the shadows, even from the grave. Julian turned back to the room where a local catering company was setting up for a meaningless corporate mixer. That was when he saw her. Sienna Hayes was balancing 3 heavy trays of champagne flutes, her uniform slightly too large, but her posture completely unyielding. When a careless guest bumped into her, she did not apologize profusely as expected of the hired help. She held the wealthy guest's gaze, calmly handed him a napkin to wipe his own spilled drink and walked away. Julian stepped into her path. Their exchange was sharp and immediate. He demanded to know who she was, and she refused to be intimidated by his tailored suit or his cold, assessing stare. Intrigued and rapidly running out of time, Julian made an impossible offer right there in the hallway. Marry him for 1 year, and she would walk away with enough money to never carry a catering tray again. Sienna hesitated. She demanded the contract in writing, her eyes flashing with a desperate, guarded intelligence that told him she needed the money just as badly as he needed a wife. The ceremony was a bleak affair in a judge's chambers. Julian wore a dark grey suit. Sienna wore a simple dress she had bought from a thrift store, flatly refusing the designer gown Julian had sent to her room earlier that morning. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss, only a firm, businesslike handshake. Marcus, Julian's longtime business partner, stood in the corner of the room, his eyes narrowed as he watched the new bride. Marcus sneered, whispering that Julian had completely lost his mind, but Julian silenced his partner with a single warning look. Life in the penthouse quickly became a battlefield of polite indifference. Sienna refused to touch his money, cooking her own meals and ignoring the household staff entirely. Julian found himself watching her when he thought she was not looking. One evening, he found her asleep over a stack of complex financial documents at the kitchen island. He carefully draped a blanket over her shoulders, pausing when she shifted, murmuring softly in her sleep. The forced proximity began to wear down their heavy defenses. During a mandatory press gala, when an aggressive reporter cornered Sienna to ask invasive questions, Julian stepped in immediately, his hand resting securely on the small of her back. For the first time, she leaned into his touch, and the spark between them was terrifyingly real. The fragile peace shattered when the private investigator Julian had hired out of habit delivered a thick file to his office. Julian read the pages, his blood running cold. Sienna was not just a struggling waitress. She was the sole survivor of the Hayes family, who had been bankrupted and destroyed by a massive offshore financial scheme 3 years ago. The revelation hit him like a physical blow, especially when he saw the name of the shell company that had orchestrated the scam. He knew that name. Julian withdrew completely. He spent late nights at the office, leaving Sienna alone in the cavernous penthouse. When they did cross paths, he was cold and distant. Sienna felt the sharp sting of his sudden rejection, her pride deeply wounded. She thought he had finally grown tired of his charity case. Yet every morning, she would find her favorite dark roast coffee freshly brewed on the kitchen counter, poured exactly the way she liked it. Julian was fighting a silent war, gathering every piece of evidence he could find, but his silence was breaking her heart. Seeing Julian distracted, Marcus made his move. He cornered Sienna in the penthouse lobby, an ugly smirk on his face. He threatened to expose her ruined past to the press, claiming he knew she was just a desperate gold digger using Julian to climb out of poverty. He promised to destroy Julian's reputation and take over Vance Global unless Sienna packed her bags and walked away quietly. Panicked but refusing to show weakness, Sienna marched straight to Julian's office, bypassing his stunned assistants. She threw open the heavy oak doors, ready to fight alongside the man she had unexpectedly fallen for. The confrontation reached its peak at the annual Vance Global shareholder meeting. Marcus confidently took the stage, preparing to call for a vote of no confidence against Julian. But before he could utter a word, Julian stood up. With Sienna standing fiercely by his side, Julian projected a series of bank transfers onto the massive screen behind the podium. He laid out the undeniable truth for every investor to see. Marcus had been embezzling from Vance Global for years, funneling the stolen money into the exact same offshore shell company that had destroyed Sienna's family. The room erupted in chaos. Marcus paled, his arrogance evaporating completely, as the boardroom doors opened and federal investigators walked in. He was handcuffed and escorted out, utterly disgraced in front of the empire he had tried to steal. That night, the penthouse was quiet again, but the heavy, suffocating silence was gone. Julian turned to Sienna, his usual armor completely stripped away. He confessed everything, apologizing for keeping her in the dark. He explained that he needed undeniable proof to take Marcus down permanently and restore her family's name without putting her in danger. He admitted that the contract meant absolutely nothing to him anymore. He did not want a business arrangement. He wanted her. Sienna looked into his eyes, the thick walls around her own heart finally crumbling. She forgave him, sealing the promise with a kiss that wiped away all their past ghosts. The months passed, turning a cold winter into a bright, promising spring. With the funds recovered from Marcus's frozen accounts, Sienna did not just rebuild her family's lost estate. She launched her own financial consulting firm to help other victims of corporate fraud. Julian stood in the back of the room during her opening speech, clapping louder than anyone else, a genuinely proud smile on his face. They had built an empire, not out of inherited wealth or forced contracts, but out of absolute trust and genuine love. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear a great romance. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories, and we will see you next time. The thick ivory envelope landed on Adrian Cole's mahogany desk with a heavy thud. It was a wedding invitation from Genevieve Roth, the woman who had broken their engagement a year ago, to align herself with his fiercest competitor. The note attached was dripping with false sweetness, practically daring him to attend alone. Adrian, the notoriously ruthless CEO of Cole Enterprises, crumpled the note in his fist. He needed a distraction, a human shield to bring to the social event of the decade, someone who would not be intimidated by the venomous elite. His sharp gaze fell upon Vivian Reed. She was his newly hired personal assistant, a woman who had spent the last 3 weeks infuriating him with her refusal to cower. When he yelled, she simply handed him his schedule and told him to lower his voice. Adrian walked out of his office and proposed a ridiculous arrangement right there by the filing cabinets. Be his glamorous, devoted partner for the next month of wedding festivities, and he would write her a check large enough to guarantee she never had to work for an arrogant billionaire again. Vivian did not blink. She calmly negotiated a higher rate, her eyes hiding a quiet desperation that made Adrian pause. The first event was a suffocating engagement gala. Adrian presented Vivian with a velvet box containing a blinding diamond necklace, expecting her to wear it like a collar of his wealth. Instead, she pushed it back across the table, choosing to wear a simple, faded locket she had brought from home. As they walked into the ballroom arm in arm, the whispers started immediately. Genevieve watched them from across the room, her smile tightening into a mask of pure jealousy, as she saw Adrian looking at his assistant with genuine intrigue instead of his usual cold indifference. The charade required them to spend hours together, pretending to be deeply in love. They attended polo matches and charity dinners, trading sharp banter that slowly softened into real conversations. One rainy evening, stranded in the back of his town car, Vivian shivered. Adrian wordlessly took off his tailored jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. As he did, a small unmarked pillbox slipped from her purse onto the leather seat. Vivian snatched it up quickly, her cheeks burning, but the vulnerability in her eyes was unmistakable. The truth came out days later, when Adrian found her leaning against the wall in the office break room, struggling to catch her breath. The fierce, unyielding Vivian finally admitted her secret. She was battling a severe chronic heart condition, and the astronomical medical bills were the only reason she endured his terrible temper at work. The revelation shattered Adrian. The money he threw around carelessly was a matter of life and death for the woman he had been using as a mere prop in his petty revenge. Guilt consumed him. Adrian withdrew, his behavior turning icy and distant because he did not know how to handle the heavy weight of real consequence. Vivian assumed he was disgusted by her weakness and prepared to pack her things. But she did not know that behind closed doors, Adrian was quietly pulling every string he had, anonymously paying off her medical debt and securing consultations with the top cardiac specialists in the world. He just did not know how to tell her. Genevieve, sensing the sudden distance between them, saw an opportunity to strike. She cornered Vivian in the powder room during the final rehearsal dinner. Genevieve sneered, revealing that she had hired someone to look into Vivian's background. She threatened to release Vivian's private medical records to the tabloids, spinning a cruel story that Adrian was using a sick, desperate employee to buy public sympathy. Genevieve promised to destroy both their lives unless Vivian left the city before the wedding the next day. Vivian refused to run. She walked straight to Adrian and told him everything. On the day of the wedding, the Grand Cathedral was packed with the city's most powerful figures. At the reception, Genevieve stood up to give a toast, her eyes locked maliciously on Vivian. But before Genevieve could speak, the massive speakers in the hall crackled to life. Adrian had called in a favor from his best friend, Nathaniel, a brilliant tech investor. A clear, damning audio recording echoed through the silent room. It was Genevieve, caught on tape just hours earlier, plotting with a lawyer to secretly drain her new husband's trust fund within the first year of marriage. The reception descended into absolute chaos. The groom dropped his champagne glass, staring at his new wife in horror. Genevieve was left standing alone on the stage, completely humiliated and abandoned by everyone in the room. Her grand social triumph turned to ashes. Adrian did not stay to watch the fallout. He took Vivian's hand and led her out of the suffocating ballroom, stepping into the cool night air. Standing by the waiting car, Adrian dropped all his pride. He told Vivian that he was done with the corporate wars, the toxic rivalries, and the hollow victories. He confessed that the only thing that mattered to him now was her, and the life they could build away from all of it. Vivian looked up at him, tears finally breaking through her stoic exterior, and pulled him into a tender, quiet kiss that promised a new beginning. Months later, the towering glass skyscraper of Cole Enterprises was just a memory. Adrian and Vivian stood on the wooden deck of a small, beautiful home near the coast of the Mediterranean. They had left the ruthless city behind to travel and focus on her recovery. As they watched the sun set over the quiet water, Adrian pulled her close, perfectly content in the peace they had fought so hard to find. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good romance. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories, and we will see you next time. The flashes of paparazzi cameras outside the glass walls of Kane Enterprises were relentless. Sebastian Kane, the ruthless and fiercely private CEO, paced the length of his boardroom. A vicious corporate dispute was tearing his empire apart. His primary rival, Damian Sterling, was orchestrating a hostile takeover, painting Sebastian in the media as a volatile, reckless playboy unfit to lead. The board of directors had given Sebastian an ultimatum. He needed to present a stable, grounded image to the public immediately, or they would vote him out. He needed a model relationship, a picture-perfect romance to feed the press and calm the nervous investors. He found the solution in the most unlikely of places. Weeks earlier, in a rare moment of exhaustion, Sebastian had created a profile on an anonymous dating app under a fake name. That was where he met Margot Ellis. She was witty, completely unimpressed by corporate status, and believed she was talking to a mid-level data analyst. When they finally met in person at a small, crowded coffee shop, Margot did not care about the expensive watch on his wrist. She argued with him about art and challenged his cynical worldview. Desperate to save his company, Sebastian confessed his true identity right there at the small wooden table. He offered her a heavily compensated, ironclad contract to be his fake fiancée for 3 months. Margot was furious at the deception, but she reluctantly agreed, desperately needing the financial payout to save the struggling community center she ran. The transition into his world was abrasive. The PR arrangement was formalized with a sterile contract signed in his penthouse. Sebastian tried to buy her an entirely new wardrobe of designer gowns, but Margot flatly refused. She showed up to their first highly publicized charity dinner, wearing a vintage dress she had owned for years, completely ignoring the judgmental whispers of the elite. When Sebastian tried to direct her conversations, she boldly defied him, charming the skeptical board members with her raw honesty and exposing the shallow emptiness of the room. Damien Sterling watched from across the banquet hall, his eyes narrowed, realizing this new woman was not the easy target he had expected. Despite the strict boundaries of their contract, the forced proximity began to blur the lines between performance and reality. The tension between them was electric, filled with sharp banter and lingering glances. One evening, after a particularly grueling press junket, Margot collapsed onto the plush sofa, shivering from a sudden fever. Sebastian cancelled a multi-million-dollar negotiation without a second thought. He spent the entire night sitting by her side, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth and making her a simple bowl of soup. There were no cameras, no board members to impress, just a quiet, profound tenderness that terrified them both. But the fragile bond shattered when an aggressive investigative journalist, secretly tipped off by Damien, published a massive feature on the front page of the Financial Times. The article exposed Margot's deepest secret. She was not just a humble community worker. She was the sole surviving heiress to the Ashford Group, a massive conglomerate. She had secretly renounced her entire fortune and changed her name years ago, running away from the toxic, manipulative family that had destroyed her childhood. The revelation hit the media like an earthquake. Sebastian felt completely betrayed, his pride wounded by the fact that she had kept such a massive secret while he was fighting to save his own legacy. A cold, suffocating silence fell over the penthouse. They barely spoke, passing each other like ghosts. Yet in his quiet moments of regret, Sebastian realized he had pushed away the only person who had ever seen the real him. He tried to make amends silently, secretly buying the building that housed her community center, and putting the deed entirely in her name, asking for nothing in return. Seeing the rift between them, Damien Sterling moved in for the final kill. He called a massive, impromptu press conference in the lobby of Kane Enterprises, intending to use the scandal to publicly humiliate Sebastian and demand the board strip him of his company. Damien planned to twist Margot's past, framing her as a corporate spy and Sebastian as a complete fool. Margot refused to be a victim again. She walked into the crowded lobby, standing shoulder to shoulder with Sebastian under the blinding lights of the cameras. Before Damien could launch his attack, Margot took the microphone. She spoke with undeniable power, owning her past and publicly exposing Damien's ruthless tactics. Simultaneously, Sebastian handed out thick folders to the front row of journalists. He had spent his silent, sleepless nights tracking Damien's offshore accounts. The documents provided undeniable proof that Damien was illegally manipulating stock prices to force the takeover. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. On live television, Damien's major investors began pulling their funding, walking out of the lobby in disgust. Damien was left standing at the podium, red-faced and utterly ruined, his reputation destroyed in front of the entire world. When the lobby finally cleared, Sebastian pulled Margot into the empty elevator. He hit the emergency stop button, plunging them into sudden quiet. He looked into her eyes, dropping all his arrogance and pride. He apologized for his reaction, telling her that he did not care about her name, her past, or the company. He just wanted the woman who had challenged him in that tiny coffee shop. Margot reached up, her own walls dissolving completely, and kissed him, a true, deeply felt promise that needed no contract to bind it. A year later, the city gathered for a very different kind of event. It was not a sterile corporate mixer, but a grand public ceremony recognizing the opening of the largest community foundation in the state, entirely funded and run by Margot. Sebastian stood proudly beside her on the stage, holding her hand as the mayor cut the ribbon. They had weathered the storm of deception and corporate greed, building a real life based on unshakable trust, mutual respect, and a love that could never be bought. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good romance. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories, and we will see you next time.
The narrative of Julian Vance and Sienna Hayes, structured through the contract marriage agreement, serves as a complex exploration of power, trauma, and ultimate redemption within a cutthroat corporate environment. The initial agreement between them, a cold proposal in a penthouse hallway following a chance meeting at a corporate mixer, perfectly encapsulates the first analytical stage, an arrangement rooted solely in power preservation and primal survival. Julian, operating under intense transgenerational pressure from his late, controlling grandfather, must marry within 48 hours to retain his controlling interest in Vance Global. Sienna, working as hired help after a devastating financial fall, is motivated by deep-seated economic desperation. Their union is thus presented not as an emotional choice, but as a pragmatic, purely social transaction, a necessary tool for Julian to secure his future and for Sienna to survive her present. The relationship immediately moves into a second phase characterized by a persistent battlefield of polite indifference within the physical constraints of the penthouse. This period marks a slow, essential emotional evolution. Proximity, even when forced, begins to wear down their heavy psychological defenses. The narrative highlights that acts of genuine care, simple yet powerful, are what ultimately breach their fortified walls. Julian silently observes Sienna and drapes a blanket over her shoulders while she sleeps. Sienna, though maintaining her distance, has her preferred dark roast coffee specifically brewed for her every morning by Julian. This gradual shift toward unexpected vulnerability is catalyzed during a mandated press gala. When an aggressive reporter confronts Sienna with invasive questions, Julian intervenes instantly, placing a secure, protective hand on her back. For the first time, she leans into his touch, and the spark between them becomes terrifically real, pushing the relationship beyond the sterile terms of their contract. The fragile peace, however, is completely shattered by the third stage, the revelation of past trauma and systemic corruption. A private investigator reveals that Sienna is not merely a struggling caterer but the sole survivor of the Hayes family, an affluent lineage destroyed by a massive offshore financial scheme 3 years prior. The pivotal realization occurs when Julian recognizes the shell company used in the scam, linking it directly back to Marcus, his own trusted business partner. The infographic analysis of this moment highlights the vast societal impact of corporate fraud, showing that it devastates lives beyond simple monetary loss. Julian, now fighting a silent war to gather undeniable proof against Marcus, pulls back into a cold isolation that Sienna misinterprets as rejection, breaking her heart just as the truth is finally aligning them against a shared enemy. The confrontation reaches its peak when Marcus, perceiving Julian's distraction and Sienna's vulnerability, moves to exploit the rift. He threatens to expose Sienna's past to destroy Julian's reputation and execute a hostile takeover of Vance Global unless she flees. Panicked but refusing to be intimidated, Sienna marches directly to Julian's office, bypassing his stunned assistants to stand with the man she now loves. At the crucial shareholder meeting, the narrative transitions to a moment of corporate justice. Marcus attempts a vote of no confidence, but Julian, with Sienna fiercely beside him, uses the evidence he silently gathered to project damning bank transfer details onto a massive screen. Julian exposes Marcus's long-term embezzlement and proves his connection to the exact scam that ruined Sienna's family. The room erupts as federal investigators enter to arrest and handcuff Marcus. The real confrontation follows that night when Julian confesses everything, stripping away his armor to explain he needed proof and sought only to restore her family's name without endangering her. The contract is finalized as obsolete, they choose love over the business arrangement, sealing the promise with a kiss that dissolves their past. The final analyzed stage, the creation of a new empire, occurs months later, turning cold winter into a promising spring. Sienna uses the funds recovered from Marcus to launch her own financial consulting firm to aid other victims of corporate fraud, transitioning from a survivor to an empowered force for change. Julian stands in the audience, clapping loudest, with a genuinely proud smile. Their final success is defined not by inherited wealth or forced contracts, but by the construction of a real life grounded in absolute trust, mutual respect, and a genuine love that can never be bought.